One of my colleagues said to me some years ago that when I hit 75, I could sit and lecture. I've gone past 75, and so I'm going to sit and lecture. I hope you don't mind. I mean, this is a young people's week in Milano. I don't know why I'm here, but you know, they need a sort of warm-up act, I guess. So I'm going to go. I've got one disappointing thing to tell you. When I was asked to come and speak, I thought, what could I do for young people? I could give them a theory of the present. Disappointment is I cannot theorize the present. I'm totally out of touch with the present. So I'm going to give you where things have been up until today. I'm going to show you the most recent project that we're working on, and then let you all, whatever. These guys have got me hooked up to something that I ain't sure. Anyway, I've got lots of notes. I'm going to try and show you, talk for about a half an hour, show you pictures for a half an hour, answer some questions, and go home. Okay. Towards a theory of the present. One of the most important moments of the 20th century historiography was Colin Rowe's comparison of Le Corbusier's Villa Garches and Palladio's Villa Malcontenta. This stunning juxtaposition served a broader purpose than just Rowe's incisive analysis of the two villas. Rather, it solidified, despite all of modern architecture's polemic against history, that in fact historical precedence was still very much active in modern architecture. But more subtly, and perhaps more elusively, it confirmed the undermining presumption that modern architecture, after all, was, like Palladio, supposedly not so hidden manifestation of the ideal. So remember the word ideal. In fact, unlike modern painting, music, and film, architecture in its visions of reinforced concrete, of steel structures, of free plan, etc., idealized its own materiality in ways in which painting and music were not obliged to. In fact, it could be argued that this latent idealization kept architecture from reaching its modernist ambitions. Two other points before I go forward must be extracted from this. First, Rowe, who in his later work would exhibit his disdain for the modern and all manifestations of the zeitgeist, would, as Jeff Kipnis has argued, be of limited critical apparatus because of his parochial fealty to ideality and humanist ideas. What I have argued in another context upon close reading, that there is little ideality in the Palladian oeuvre. However, another historian and critic, Rosalind Krauss, would argue that the problem with modern architecture theory was what she called the hermeneutic phantom. As one could force the coming into consciousness, that was what the modernism was about, that is, making people more conscious of their being. It could be argued that modern was about just the opposite of ideality. It was, in fact, making strange. And that capacity to make strange was to render the work of art a cognitive object. Remember, cognitive object. You probably, I don't know what it means in English, you probably don't know what it means in Italian, but just remember cognitive object. It was a reflection upon the modes of consciousness. So the modern, in all of its aspects, was not at all about ideality, but about defamiliarization of the human subject with the environment. That is, to estrange the human from what was familiar. The argument that Krauss makes is that the architects were forcing the reader's attention in the actual procedure to the actual procedure of making, of writing, of telling, and directly exhibiting the technical substructure of that story. For many critics, the strategies of establishing the work of art as a cognitive rather than as a mimetic object were ones of locating the defining or limiting norms of the discourse, that is, its constitutive aspects. There was something about this procedure, that is, limiting the process of making, there was something about that procedure that was inconsistent with the grounds of modernism. That was because in painting and sculpture, those things, and music and film would work. They wouldn't work with the idealization of concrete and steel that was in architecture. And so therefore, architecture never became what painting, sculpture, film, and music did. It was something different. And there was this inconsistency with that procedure in architecture. And if we are told that glass as such, or steel as such, are merely the conduits to the direct experience of the building as structure, the pure perception of the support system, then we realize this inconsistency. So, to summarize, what he's saying is that what modern architecture attempted to do in its theorization was to make the virtual object, that is, the object within the object, to be part of a cognitive process. And this cognitive process would produce in architecture what Krauss called a hermeneutic phantom. Now, to return to Palladio and his role today. Palladio, for me, stands as an avatar of the possibility of architecture as the digital realm, let's say, versus historical precedents. He stands for an architect on the precipice between the ideal and the disjunctive. And as Palladio did between archaeology and innovation, so do questions of the ideal put forward in support of the 20th century theorizing are problematic today in the 21st century. Today, therefore, we cannot theorize what the 19th century or the 18th century contributed to modern architecture. That's its precedent, because the discipline is also at the precipice. It is on the edge of a situation where there is little belief in the value of precedent to animate the built world. Kipnis has argued that it is precisely through intellection, through an architecture of what he calls close reading, that we can overcome architecture's suborning us to the power structure. What could be argued is that architecture always services the power, and the more it is responsible and responsive to comfort, to beauty, to pleasure, to organization, the more it serves power. And so what Kipnis would argue is that when we try and interrupt and interject or disjunct the relationship between what architecture does and what it is used for. If we can do that, the closer there is the reading, the more probable is of interjecting between architecture and its client. There was the false belief in the ideal promoted by modern architecture, but the ideal provided a frame which is closed today. The digital is not that frame. Before we go on with the assumptions that need to be made, first of all, if in fact 20th century architecture burdened the very idealism that modernism sought to overcome, it would initially seem that the advent of digital processes, that is what we are all working with today, that is Rhino, Maya, and the like, would in fact be the ideal platforms for producing an architecture without any memory, precedence, or context. Digital programs, in fact, are projects of what I would call erasure, which begin with the geometric primitive that can be infinitely manipulated, producing what seems to be a complexity which demands close reading. So if we're saying that close reading interjects between satisfaction and the individual, it would seem that the digital and its programs, its processes, would be ideal. The thing is, what is argued is that only by suspending, i.e. erasing the supposed self-evidence of the profound influences on a work, that is humanist idealism, could a work produce a distance from the political. And so that one could say that traditionally architecture exerts through its qualities of intimacy, repose, transcendence, awe, majesty, insidious control over people only that are not paying attention. In other words, architecture is doing what it's supposed to be doing to have effect precisely when it's with its most powerful. So what the argument would be is, why not the digital? And why not the digital as a frame for this distancing, number one? First of all, because the digital starts with a primitive that has no history, no context, and no memory. Every one of you that start with something on a computer start with a geometric three-dimensional form that is there for no reason. It could be a cube, it could be a rectangle, it could be anything you wanted, but it didn't come from any historical precedence. And so what one does is always to manipulate this primitive from its ideal state to supposedly its disjunctive state. So if it has no, the primitive has no context, no precedence, no history, no memory, then it is only an erasure of those things. Disjunctiveness, therefore, brings a shift from the intellectual to the emotive, and that's the key issue. Whether, in fact, this disjunctiveness that the computer brings allows one to shift from a environment of emotion to an environment of the intellectual. And the argument is that if we keep the emotive, we will still be subservient to a power of some kind of close reading. What we draw sometimes, therefore, outside of the computer, casually doodling in the moments often that have more content than we would like to admit. This is not to suggest that when a student sketches a church or a housing project or a civic building, that it contains the kind of meaning that has been talked about. In fact, in this example, it's quite the reverse. Students' sketches often miss any animating idea of a building or an architect's sketch. For example, students rarely, when they are sketching, sketch plans of historical buildings, and these plans are often the most evocative indications of building ideas. But why should an idle sketch have any relevance to the title of this talk? Yet it is precisely its relevance to the student that bears attention. Today, most work begins not with a sheet of tracing paper, not with a pencil, but with an empty computer screen, and with the use of any number of 3D design algorithms or programs. The beginning of a design process is an amorphous 3D blob, which can be easily manipulated to produce what appear to be architectures. But these productions are avatars of architecture, not architecture itself. When you have a situation in a primitive that has no history or no precedence, no memory or no context or even no scale, only when an architecture can produce these without the ideal, without the hermeneutic, will a theory of the present be able to be possible. So the argument is that the theories that I have talked about, from Palladio to Le Corbusier to Aldo Rossi, written about all of these people, their theoretical meaning of their work, etc., cannot be used and transferred to the digital processes, that they no longer have any relevance to what my students are doing. And so the thing is that to teach precedence without being able to produce a computer program that is able to absorb precedence, history, memory of a building, then the theoretical work that I have done in the past, and especially today in teaching, becomes problematic. What I want to do tonight is to show you a building and a process of design that we've been working on in the past 2 years in Istanbul, Turkey, to show you what I mean by how we can take, perhaps, as a beginning of theorizing, and I'm showing you an actual design which enables one to, in retrospect, look back and theorize its structure. So I'm going to show you a project that's just starting to build in Istanbul, an archaeological museum in the Yenikapı area, and to show you how it demands close reading, how through the computation it produces a memory and a history and a difficult way of understanding building that could be a theoretical model for understanding computation and the digital processes today. So with that, I'm going to start the images, and we can, I suppose, oh, we got it there. Good. Let's see if I can do this. This is not my strong point. Okay? I wanted to show you, first of all, I theorized a book of Palladian drawings, and I started with the Villa Rotunda, which is supposedly the most ideal and symmetrical. And of course, what one realizes is that even though it's got four porticos, etc., the passages from the portico to the central space are different from the front to the back than they are to the side. So even in the Palladian, the most Palladian, symmetrical and ideal of villas, there is a disjunction, an interruption with the organization. And this is the last villa that I analyzed in the book on Palladio Virtuelle, and this is the Villa Repetto. And what you can realize in this villa is the absence of the villa. That is, the no longer the traditional villa plan. These are what are called the barns or barchesa. There are the two corner towers, but there is the front yard or the rear yard and the arcade, two towers and an arcade, but no building. So Palladio went from an ideal situation to a disjunctive condition. That's really useful if you're dealing with traditional design orientation. That becomes very helpful to understand how to create disjunction in a non-digital era. Then we're going to go from that to the site in Turkey. This is the Marmara. This is the new Yanakapi Railroad Station. So there is a kind of four axes relationship, and there is a quadrant here, which is what we were given as our site for the museum. We started with something like that as an animating idea and found out that we couldn't continue with this idea of the four square notion. We looked to the different walls that surrounded the harbor here, and the most ancient of the walls was this brown wall, a red wall, as the sea gradually receded, and this yellow wall was the most recent. We tried to use these sea walls as part of the content of the project, as you will see. And this was the first model that we built. This is the railroad station and the Museum of Archaeology, Building A and Building B. We're going to be looking at Building A. We wanted to find a way to modulate and create a disjunction and rereading at the same time without doing something very much historical that was possible. These are sketches that I was making in the process of thinking. What we did was take an accidental trip to Hagia Sophia one day, and we looked at the building organization. And what we found was in the corner, which was to be repeated in all four corners, a very strange organizing grid that we found no other Byzantine monument or anything from the Middle East conformed to this organization. It was rather unique. Whether it led to the uniqueness of Hagia Sophia, I cannot say. But what we thought was if we extrapolated this organization, which to something like this, and you see the red is the modulation that was repeated two times, was repeated in Hagia Sophia. We could make a connection to history without an obvious nod. Now, nobody that we've shown this to looks at it and says, oh, there's Hagia Sophia, because it's not iconic, it's structural. In other words, it has a structural organization that's unique that you only find in Hagia Sophia, and it would only be, you would be able to have to walk through this and someday walk through Hagia Sophia and say, hey, those two things have the same modulation. And so we were very excited by this because we had never created a structure that came out of an actual, as opposed to geometric grid, like an ABA or an ABCBA, any kind of an ideal grid. We were able to organize the museum structure through this red overlay. And you see also in the diagram the continuation through the gray pieces through the length of the building. We were given the site. You say, well, why does the building have that shape? When they were excavating for the railroad station, which is just to the east of our site, or the south of our site, east and south, they found 36 boats of prehistoric nature, which is the particular collection that our project is. And therefore, there was a hole on the site, and they said, okay, we've got these boats, we've got a hole, fill up the hole with your building. And so the building conforms to a pre-existing hole, and what we did was to merely place it in the Hagia Sophia grid. And there you can see a view of it with one level of the grid of Hagia Sophia that became the structural grid for the museum. And again, looking at the layers of again, crazy things that one began always to look at was not only the built environment, but the land organization, the stratification of the ground, as it were. And, come on, there you go. And that stratification, which you can see abstracted up in the top, became a layering of the vertical surfaces here within the grid of Hagia Sophia became the facade of the building. And you can see this a really incredibly strange grid. It's a D, E, A, B, C, D, E, A, B. It's a rhythm that repeats itself, but doesn't give over to a stratification of something very static. It's very mobile, as you can see in the stratification, not only of the ground, but placed over the Hagia Sophia grid. And this is called close reading. You can look at the subset grids under these, and you'll see another layering that contains all of the vertical mullions and frames of doors and windows that are subsumed within the grid. Is it compulsive? Yes. Is it obsessive? Yes. But is it an attempt to overcome the anonymous nature of something on the digital? And so this comes out of a lot of human, let's say, stressing the object in a way that is not necessarily possible alone on the digital processes. And so you get an organization of a building within a gridded structure that looks something like this, and produces an object like this piece of gray wood there. And the rest of it is inconsequential right now because we're only talking about this piece right now, which is the piece that has been commissioned. Here you can see there are three major museum levels. These are the reflected ceiling plans because a lot of the marking, the iconic nature of the space is recorded in the ceiling grids. And this goes down to the lights, the sprinklers, the alarms, the loudspeakers. All of the things that usually go into a ceiling have been orchestrated in these ceiling plans. And a very complex process. And of course, when we're working with a very important engineer, worldwide group like Arup, and they don't like to change their thinking. They like everything to be on a regular grid as opposed to an irregular grid. And so we had to constantly redo engineering drawings to be able to produce the coordination of the ceiling plans with all of the issues that were involved in the process. What we did in order to study the spatial organization, we built sectional models in the office out of cardboard so that we could study every section, because as you can see, every section is a different organization. There's no necessary relationship in section from one section to another, but it gave us what the spatial organization and experience would be like from end to end. I should point out that the reason for the length of the building and the height is that we were in a plane, an airplane landing zone number 1, but we couldn't be taller than, I think it was 40 meters, because we couldn't interfere with any minaret on any of the mosques, which are just to the east of us. So we were limited to 3 stories in building, and therefore, the length of the project became the length of the hole that we had to fill, and so you get this particular organization. Here are some of the sectional models that we made. You can ask us, well, where are the exhibitions? First of all, we have no museum director. We have no museum structure for anybody telling us what the museum is to be like, how it is to be displayed. And so all we have is a very well worked out architectural structure that hopefully will receive the boats, and we know that the 36 boats will fit into the spaces that we have. You have to realize also that the people that are our clients are for one, municipal employees, and their knowledge of architecture is also very limited, their knowledge of structure, etc. So we're sort of flying blind on whether the museum is appropriate to what we're doing. You can see on the facade more clearly, on the facade models, the striations of the Earth's surface recorded onto the facade. You can see the grid of the Hagia Sophia in each part of the facade, and the way glass is fit in, the way glass works on the ground floor, on the entry, and where there are solid stone or masonry pieces. But the facades are really very, as well as the ceiling plans, a useful indication of the project. Here is from one aspect of the street, one end of the project, the east end of the project, and the moving back. And again, you can see the end layers as opposed to the horizontal layers. Again, one of the horizontal sections, and you have to realize also how to structure this kind of organization that doesn't come down to the ground. And just think about this cantilever and how you do that. We went through 2 structural engineers in order to be able to do this. So it's clearly not what you'd call an easy building. But again, what I want to say something very positive about working in Turkey. In every other country where we've worked, we work more or less to this kind of detail, and then something takes over called value engineering. I don't know if you have such a thing in Italy, but value engineering means let's take out as much architecture as we can before we have to close the price. This building, and we're ready to bid it, has never been value engineered once. That all of this stuff, and you can think about Turkey and its relationship to the political situation today in the world, has been an amazing process because nobody says no. And for an architect, that's really unusual. And there's not one country, whether it's Germany, whether it's Italy, whether it's United States, Japan, Korea, whatever, that don't have value engineering. When you get, some of you who are already in practice will find that some of the nicest things that you do get value engineered out. In Turkey, I find it really difficult to understand why they haven't done that. But maybe I'm being naive. Some of the interior spaces, we've really worked very hard. You can see how the ceilings are really important to the space, as are the floors. So you see the different floor materials, the different ceiling materials, and the different lighting possibilities for, this is what has driven our lighting engineers a little bit crazy, because we wanted to not have any downlights. Like, I hate ceilings with downlights. I want to always send light up, wash walls, and send lights up to wash the ceilings. And so all of these ceilings are set up with reveals that allow for lighting to wash the horizontal surface. Again, I think really important. Here is a view, a recent view of the project. You can see what it will be like. It certainly doesn't look like anything, but not that we can tell, but anyway. And here is the final roof shot of the project. What I think is important to understand about this digital era, because we're building a building with Lorenzo degli Esposti in Milano right now for a condominium project, which is under construction. And what we were saying about that project has something to do with what we're doing in Istanbul, and that is trying to take the spirit of the past without being nostalgic or mimetic, and making it part of what one calls a cognitive object, where the present and the history of being in Milano or in Istanbul comes through. And what I would like to argue is when you see the project for Milano, it looks nothing like this. You wouldn't say, oh, that's a project with Peter Eisenman, etc., because this project also doesn't look like anything like Peter Eisenman. We would like to think that its cognitive processes look like the possibility of Istanbul. And Istanbul today, not Istanbul 200 years ago or tomorrow. And we say the same thing about our project in Milano, that it takes from the history of housing blocks in Milano, which look very different than the housing blocks in Torino, which look very different than the housing organization in Roma, the Palazzina process. So we're trying to take those things that make up a cognitive object that cause close reading, that in fact are not emotive, but require one to step back from the being of within the project, the being of the experience of the project, and producing something that is of today in Milano on one hand, and of today on Istanbul on the other. Thank you very much.